There are certain discoveries that don't just challenge history, they quietly refuse to fit inside it. Not because they are fake, not because they are misunderstood, but because even when you strip away the exaggeration, the speculation, the internet theories, something still doesn't add up. Across different parts of the world, across civilizations that never met, across thousands of years, we keep finding the same thing. Objects that look too advanced, art that feels too familiar, knowledge that appears far too early. And the deeper you look, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Because at first, it's easy to explain one mystery. Maybe it's symbolism. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's just the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But eight separate discoveries, each with its own evidence, each raising the same quiet question, that's where coincidence begins to lose its grip. Tonight, we're not going to jump to conclusions. We're not going to claim aliens or rewrite history in a single sentence. Instead, we're going to do something far more unsettling. We're going to look carefully at what was found, at what is known, and at the details that refuse to go away. Because by the end of this, you may not walk away with answers, but you will walk away with a question that's much harder to ignore. What if history is not wrong, but incomplete? Long before the pyramids, before written language, before the first cities rose above the horizon, there were people living in southern Mesopotamia, and they left behind something deeply unsettling. Archaeologists working at sites like Eridu and Tel Al-Ubaid expected to find tools, pottery, early signs of human settlement. And they did, but mixed among those ordinary objects were figures that didn't belong. Not stylistically, not culturally, not even biologically. They were humanoid, but only just. Their bodies were familiar. Arms, legs, torsos shaped like ours. But their heads were wrong. Elongated, stretched backward into unnatural proportions. Their faces tapered into narrow, almost beak-like shapes. Their eyes were large, almond-shaped and hollow. And where you expect the softness of human features, there was something cold. Something reptilian. These are what we now call the Ubaid figurines, and they are among the oldest human-made representations ever discovered, dating back over 7,000 years. Let that sink in. 7,000 years ago, someone sat down, shaped clay with their hands, and deliberately created this. At first glance, it's easy to dismiss them as stylized art. Ancient people didn't always aim for realism. They exaggerated features. They simplified forms. They expressed ideas, not accuracy. But the deeper you look, the harder that explanation becomes to hold. Because these figures are not random. They are consistent. The same elongated skulls, the same slanted eyes, the same narrow faces, repeated again and again and again, across multiple sites, across generations. And then there are the details. Some of the figurines are clearly female, carefully shaped hips, defined breasts, not abstract, intentional. Others hold what appear to be staffs or scepters, symbols of authority, status, power. But one figure in particular changes everything. A seated female, cradling a child, breastfeeding. It is one of the most human scenes imaginable. A mother feeding her baby. A moment of care, of life, of connection. And yet, both the mother and the child have the same elongated skull, the same inhuman face. This is not a god in the sky, not a monster to be feared. This is something far more unsettling. It is normal life. And that detail matters, because ritual objects tend to exaggerate. They dramatize. They represent something larger than life. But these figurines feel almost domestic, almost personal, like portraits. So the question becomes unavoidable. If these are not symbolic, then what are they? One explanation comes from physical anthropology. At several ancient sites, researchers have found evidence of cranial deformation, a practice where the skull is intentionally reshaped during infancy. Bindings applied over time, gradually elongating the head. It's a real phenomenon. It happened in multiple cultures, and it does produce elongated skulls. But here's the problem. Even the most extreme cases do not produce faces like these. They don't create tapered jaws. They don't reshape the eyes. They don't transform human anatomy into something that looks fundamentally different. So either these figurines are highly stylized exaggerations, or they are depicting something that people at the time recognized. And this is where the mystery deepens, because reptilian or serpent-like beings are not unique to Mesopotamia. They appear everywhere. In Mesoamerica, you have Quetzalcoatl. In South America, Kukulkan. In India, the Nagas. In ancient Egypt, serpent symbolism woven into royal power. Different continents, different cultures, no known contact. And yet, a similar form keeps appearing. Now, to be clear, similar symbols don't automatically mean a shared origin. Humans often create similar myths. Snakes are powerful symbols. They shed their skin. They move silently. They inspire both fear and reverence. But here's what makes the Ubaid figurines different. These are not just symbols. They are physical representations. Three-dimensional, detailed, repeated with intention. Which brings us to a possibility that sits right on the edge of academic comfort, not widely accepted, not easily dismissed. What if these figures are not mythological at all? What if they are representations of a real social class, an elite group, a priesthood, individuals who altered their appearance to resemble something they believed in, or something they served? It would explain the skull shapes, it would explain the authority symbols, it would explain the consistency. But it leaves one final question, one that doesn't go away. Why choose that form? Why elongate the head? Why create faces that look so distinctly non-human? Because imitation usually has a source, and whether that source was purely symbolic or something far more literal is a question that has been sitting quietly in the background of archaeology for decades. Because when you look into those hollow eyes, you're not just looking at ancient art, you're looking at a decision, a choice made thousands of years ago to represent something that still doesn't fully make sense today. And maybe the most unsettling part of all is this: whoever made them didn't think they were strange. The Sabo Dissek, a machine with no machine. There are some discoveries that don't shock you immediately. They don't look impossible at first glance. They don't feel out of place. In fact, they seem almost ordinary, until someone looks closer, and then everything changes. The year is 1936. Egyptologist Walter Bryan Emery is working in the ancient burial grounds of Saqqara, a site already heavy with history, layer upon layer of tombs, stretching back to the very beginnings of Egyptian civilization. This was not an era of mystery. This was an era we believed we understood, the First Dynasty, around 3100 BC, the dawn of organized Egypt. Kings, officials, early writing, early architecture, primitive compared to what would come later. Or at least, that's what we thought. Inside one particular tomb belonging to a noble named Sabu Emery and his team, uncovered what they expected: stone vessels, tools, everyday objects, the quiet remains of a life long gone. And then they found it, buried beneath the floor, carefully placed, almost hidden. A disc, roughly 61 centimeters in diameter, carved from a material known as schist. Now, that detail might not sound important, but it is everything, because schist is not forgiving. It is brittle, fragile, unpredictable. You cannot shape it easily. You cannot correct mistakes. One wrong strike and the entire piece shatters. Yet somehow, this disc had been carved into a form that shouldn't exist in that material. At the center, a raised cylindrical hub, extending outward, 3 thin curved lobes, perfectly spaced, perfectly shaped, each one tapering with a smoothness that feels almost engineered. Not decorative, not random, but precise. At first it was cataloged like any other artifact, another unusual object, another curiosity. But as time passed, and as technology advanced, people began to look at it differently. Engineers, designers, Individuals trained not in history, but in function. And what they saw was deeply unsettling, because the shape of the Sabre disc does not just resemble something familiar, it aligns with it. Modern engineers began comparing it to a hydrodynamic impeller, a component used in pumps and turbines, designed to move fluid, to create pressure, to generate flow. And the similarities were not vague, they were specific. The curvature of the lobes, the angle of the edges, the symmetry of the design, even the thinning of the material toward the outer edges, all matched principles used in modern mechanical systems. Now pause for a moment, because this is where the story shifts. Ancient Egypt, at this stage in history, had no known concept of turbines, no pumps, no machines requiring fluid dynamics, no theoretical framework for that level of engineering. And yet, here is an object that appears to follow those exact principles. So naturally, archaeologists proposed a simpler explanation. They suggested it was a ceremonial vessel, a decorative object, perhaps a stone imitation of a metal design, something symbolic, something artistic. And to be fair, that explanation is not unreasonable. Ancient Egyptians created symbolic objects all the time. They experimented with form. They pushed artistic boundaries. But there's a problem. Symbolism does not require this level of precision. Decoration does not demand aerodynamic curves. Ritual objects do not need structural logic that mirrors functional engineering. Because if this is just art, then why does it behave like a machine component? And if it is a machine component, then where is the machine? No supporting parts have ever been found. No system, no mechanism, no evidence of anything it could have belonged to. Just the disc, alone. And that isolation makes it even stranger, because it suggests one of two things. Either this object was never functional. It only looks functional to modern eyes, a coincidence of form, or it was once part of something larger, something that no longer exists, something we have never found. And that second possibility opens a door that history is not entirely comfortable walking through. Because if the Sabre disc was functional, then it implies knowledge, knowledge of form, knowledge of motion, knowledge of motion, knowledge of forces that we do not associate with that time. And that leads to a question that becomes difficult to ignore. Where did that knowledge come from? Some researchers have suggested that the disc may be a stone copy, a replica of an original object made from a different material, perhaps metal, perhaps something more durable. If that were true, then the disc is not the original idea. It is an imitation. But imitation requires exposure. You cannot copy something you have never seen. So what was the original? A lost technology? A forgotten experiment? An object passed down from a culture we no longer recognize? Or something else entirely? There is another detail that often gets overlooked: the craftsmanship. Even if we remove all speculation about function, even if we assume this is purely symbolic, the act of carving this shape from that material, with the tools available at the time, is still extraordinary. It requires control, patience, skill at a level that suggests deep familiarity with the material. This was not an accident, not a casual creation. It was deliberate, which means someone, thousands of years ago, sat down with a piece of fragile stone and chose to create this exact form. Not something similar, not something approximate. This, and they succeeded. Flawlessly. No cracks, no fractures, no visible errors. Just a perfect execution of a design that still raises questions today. And perhaps that is what makes the Sabre disc so unsettling. Not that it looks advanced, not that it resembles modern technology, but that it exists at all, because it forces us to confront a possibility that sits just beneath the surface of history, that ancient people may have understood more than we assume, that their knowledge may not fit neatly into our timelines, that their capabilities may have extended further than we are comfortable admitting, or that we are looking at something out of context, out of time, a fragment of a story we have not yet pieced together. Today, the Sabre disc rests quietly in the Egyptian Museum, Cairo, displayed behind glass, labeled, catalogued, but not explained. Visitors walk past it every day. Some glance at it, some stop. Some feel that subtle pull of curiosity, that quiet sense that something isn't quite right, and then they move on, because it's easier that way. It's easier to accept that it's just an object, just a curiosity, just another artifact in a long timeline of human history. But every now and then, someone looks at it a little longer and asks a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. If this object truly belongs to us time, then why does it feel like it doesn't? And if it doesn't belong, then where exactly did it come from? The helicopter carvings that shouldn't exist. There are moments in archaeology when something doesn't just look unusual, it looks impossible. Not because it's broken, not because it's damaged, but because it appears to show something that should not exist in that time. Deep inside the ancient temple complex of Temple of Seti I, there is a chamber most visitors would walk past without a second thought. Stone walls, hieroglyphs, the familiar language of ancient Egypt carved with precision and care. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Until you look up, because etched into a stone lintel just above eye level is a carving that stops people cold the moment they see it. It looks like a helicopter, not vaguely, not abstractly, but clearly, a long body, a cockpit, a tail boom, even what appears to be rotor blades extending from the top, and beside it, other shapes, one resembling a submarine, another that looks strikingly similar to a modern aircraft, and something that could pass, at a glance, for a futuristic vehicle. All grouped together, all carved into the same surface, all sitting inside a temple that dates back over 3,000 years. Now, pause, because this is where the mind begins to split. One part of you immediately searches for a logical explanation. Ancient art can be symbolic, it can be misinterpreted, it can degrade over time, but another part sees something familiar, something too familiar. Because the human brain is extremely good at recognizing shapes, and when something matches closely enough, it's hard to unsee it. This is what makes the Abydos carving so powerful. Once you see the helicopter, you cannot unsee it. And for decades, this image has circulated across books, documentaries, and the internet, presented as evidence of something extraordinary. Advanced ancient technology, lost civilizations, even contact with beings who possessed knowledge far beyond what we attribute to early Egypt. But archaeology, as always, offers a different explanation, one that is less dramatic, but far more grounded. They call it a palimpsest. In ancient Egypt, inscriptions were sometimes modified. A pharaoh would come to power and overwrite the achievements of his predecessor. Names were erased, titles were replaced, new carvings were layered on top of old ones. At this temple, the original inscriptions were created during the reign of Seti I. Later, his son Ramses II altered them. Plaster was used to fill in the older carvings. New hieroglyphs were etched over the surface. For a time, everything looked clean, ordered, intentional. But time has a way of undoing things. Over thousands of years, the plaster began to erode. The layers separated, and the original carvings beneath started to reappear. Not fully, not cleanly, but partially. And when two different sets of hieroglyphs carved at different times begin to overlap, something strange happens. They merge. Shapes distort, lines intersect, symbols combine. And occasionally, by pure coincidence, they form patterns that resemble something entirely different. This is the official explanation, and on paper, it makes sense. But here's where the discomfort begins. Because for that explanation to fully satisfy, you have to accept something very specific. You have to accept that two completely unrelated inscriptions, carved years apart, by different hands, with different meanings, overlapped in such a precise way that they accidentally created shapes that resemble multiple modern machines. Not just one, but several. A helicopter, an aircraft, a submarine-like form, all emerging from the same damaged section of stone. And that's where the debate refuses to die. Because coincidence is a powerful explanation, but it has limits. And when multiple coincidences appear in the same place, aligned in a way that feels almost intentional, people start asking questions. Some researchers have argued that what we're seeing is exactly what it looks like, that the carvings are not accidental, that they represent knowledge, visual knowledge, of machines that should not exist in that period. Now, to be clear, this view is not accepted by mainstream archaeology. There is no physical evidence of helicopters in ancient Egypt, no metal fragments, no technological remains, no supporting artifacts. And that absence matters, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But even when you remove the more extreme interpretations, something still lingers, because the carvings are real, the shapes are real, the resemblance is real, and the human response to them is also real. That moment of recognition, that brief pause, that subtle discomfort, because it forces you to confront a strange possibility. Not that ancient Egyptians had helicopters, but that our interpretation of the past might not be as complete as we believe. There's another layer to this, one that often goes unnoticed. The carvings are not isolated. They are surrounded by hieroglyphs that have been clearly translated, and those inscriptions are not technical. They are not mechanical. They are religious, prayers, offerings, dedications to the gods, which means whoever carved or altered that section of the temple placed those strange shapes right alongside the names of divine beings, not hidden, not obscured, integrated, as if, in their world, there was no contradiction. As if the idea of advanced objects and the idea of gods belonged in the same conversation. Now, that doesn't prove anything extraordinary, but it does reveal something important. Ancient people did not separate the world the way we do. To them, the sky was not just empty space, it was inhabited, active, meaningful. The unknown was not dismissed, it was integrated into belief. And sometimes, that integration produced imagery that feels strange to us today, because we are looking at it from the outside, from a different time, with different assumptions. And yet, despite all the explanations, despite the logic, despite the evidence supporting the palimpsest theory, the image remains uncomfortable, unresolved, because it sits right on the edge of understanding, clear enough to recognize, ambiguous enough to question, and maybe that's why it continues to capture attention, not because it proves something extraordinary, but because it reminds us that even when we think we understand the past, there are still moments where it looks back at us and feels unfamiliar. And perhaps that is the most important detail of all, not what the carving is, but what it does. It creates doubt, a small, persistent doubt that maybe, just maybe, there are pieces of history we are still seeing through the wrong lens, the stone that maps a world without words. There are some discoveries that feel mysterious, and then there are those that feel deliberate, as if someone wasn't just creating something, but trying to record something. In the late 19th century, in a quiet field near Clydebank, Scotland, a man named James Harvey noticed something unusual beneath the soil. At first, it didn't seem important, just a large slab of sandstone, flat, partially buried, unremarkable. But when the surface was cleared, what emerged was something no one expected. The stone was covered, not with cracks, not with natural erosion, but with carvings, hundreds of them, circles carved into the surface, some small, some large, many surrounded by rings, others connected by lines, spirals unfolding into spirals, patterns layered over patterns. This is what we now call the Kuchno stone, one of the largest and most complex examples of prehistoric rock art ever discovered. It measures roughly 13 meters by 8 meters, about the size of a tennis court, and nearly every inch of its surface is marked. At first, researchers did what they always do. They classified it. They compared it. They placed it within a known category, cup and ring marks. These types of carvings are found across the British Isles, in parts of Europe, even in regions as distant as India and South America. And for decades, the explanation seemed simple. Symbolism, ritual, decoration, ancient people carving patterns for reasons we may never fully understand. But then something changed, because for a long time, the Kuchno stone was studied the only way it could be, from the ground, by eye. Which means something important was missing. perspective. In 2016, archaeologists returned to the site with modern technology, 3D scanning, digital mapping, precision analysis. For the first time, they weren't just looking at the stone, they were analyzing it, and what emerged was not random. The carvings, when viewed in full digital relief, revealed consistency, depths that matched, angles that repeated, spacing that followed patterns. The spirals weren't freehand, they were structured. The rings weren't decorative, they were measured. And the connections between them were intentional. This was not chaotic art. This was design. But design for what? That question is where everything begins to shift. Because when researchers stepped back, when they viewed the stone not as individual carvings but as a complete composition, something strange appeared. The layout started to resemble a map, not clearly, not perfectly, but suggestively. Clusters of carvings aligned in ways that echoed surrounding landscapes, elevations, natural formations, possible water paths, as if the stone was not just marked, but mapped. Now pause, because mapping requires something very specific: awareness. You cannot map a landscape unless you understand it. You cannot represent space unless you can conceptualize it. And here's the detail that makes this difficult to ignore. The Kochno stone dates back to around 3000 BC, a time when there was no written language in that region, no formal cartography, no known system for recording geography. And yet, here is a surface that appears to encode spatial information, but it doesn't stop there. Because some researchers noticed something else. Certain alignments on the stone seemed to correspond not just to the land, but to the sky, patterns that could reflect celestial positions, movements, cycles, not confirmed, not universally accepted, but enough to raise a question. What if this stone was doing more than one thing? What if it wasn't just a map of the Earth, but a connection between Earth and something above it? Now, to be clear, these interpretations are debated. Mainstream archaeology still leans toward symbolic explanations, ritual use, cultural expression, and those explanations are valid, but they don't fully account for the precision, because symbolism can be loose, expressive, flexible. This feels controlled, and control suggests intention. Which brings us to a deeper, more unsettling idea. What if the Kochno stone is not meant to be understood at a glance? What if it's not art, but information? Encoded, layered, structured in a way that requires perspective to decode, because from ground level, it looks abstract, but from above, it begins to organize, and that detail matters, because the people who carved this stone did not have aerial views. No drones, no aircraft, no way to look down and see the full layout as we do today. And yet, the composition only fully reveals itself when viewed from that perspective. So how did they design it? How did they maintain proportion across such a large surface? How did they ensure alignment? Was it done piece by piece over generations, or was there a guiding system, a method we no longer understand? And then there is one more detail: the repetition. Because the Kochno stone is not unique, similar cup and ring patterns appear across Scotland, Ireland, Spain, Scandinavia, and beyond. Different regions, different cultures, no known contact. And yet, the same visual language appears: circles, rings, connections. Now again, this does not prove a global system. Human beings often create similar patterns independently. But when patterns repeat across distance and across time, it invites a question. Is this coincidence, or is this a shared way of thinking, a method of recording that existed before written language? Because if that's true, then stones like Kochno are not just art, they are messages, not written in words, not meant to be read like text, but designed to be interpreted, and perhaps reinterpreted, and perhaps reinterpreted over generations. There's a reason the Kochno stone was eventually reburied. Not destroyed, not removed, but covered, protected from damage, from weather, from time. Almost as if, even in modern times, we recognize that it holds something we haven't fully understood yet. Today, it rests beneath the earth once again, hidden, silent, a surface covered in markings that we can see, but not fully explain. And maybe that is what makes it so powerful, not that it gives us answers, but that it presents us with a possibility that long before written language, before maps, before recorded history, humans may have already been trying to capture something far more complex than we assume, not just the world around them, but their place within it. And if that's true, then the Kochno stone is not just a relic of the past, it's a reminder that there may have been ways of understanding, ways of recording, ways of thinking that we have not lost completely, but have not yet remembered either. The sky bees, Wells never left. There are places in the world where history is not written in books, not carved into tablets, not stored in museums. It is painted onto stone, layer by layer, generation after generation. And in one of the most remote regions on Earth, those paintings tell a story that is never fully faded. In the rugged landscape of the Kimberley region in northwestern Australia, there are caves, shelters carved naturally into the rock, protected from wind, from rain, from time itself. And inside those shelters are figures, tall, still, watching. They are known as the Wandjina. To the Aboriginal people of this land, they are not myths. They are not symbols. They are beings, ancient, powerful, present. At first glance, the figures are simple, almost minimal. But the longer you look, the stranger they become. Their bodies are pale, featureless, almost ghost-like. Their heads are large, disproportionately so, oval in shape, dominating the entire figure. Their eyes are wide, dark, unblinking, and perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, they have no mouths, no expression, no speech, just silence. Around their heads, radiating lines extend outward, like energy, like light, like something contained, or something being emitted, and framing those heads, what appears almost like a helmet, or a halo. Now pause, because this is where interpretation begins to divide. From a modern perspective, it's easy to project. The large heads resemble helmets. The eyes resemble visors. The radiating lines resemble energy fields. And suddenly, the figures begin to look familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Because they resemble something we've seen before. Not in history, but in modern imagination. And that's where many theories begin. But to understand the Wandjina, you have to step away from modern thinking. Because to the Aboriginal communities of the Kimberley, these figures are not mysterious. They are known, they are the creators. According to tradition, the Wandjina came from the sky. They descended to earth, they shaped the land, formed the rivers, brought the rains. They established the laws of nature, the order of the world, and when their work was done, they did not leave completely. They transformed. Their presence remained in the land, in the sky, and in the images painted onto the rock. But here's the detail that changes everything. These paintings are not static. They are maintained, repainted, refreshed, preserved. For thousands of years, strict cultural laws govern this process. Not everyone is allowed to repaint them. Not every detail can be altered, because these are not just images. They are living representations. And if they are not maintained, it is believed that the balance of nature itself is affected. Rainfall, seasons, the health of the land, all connected. Now think about that. This is not distant mythology. This is an active belief system, one that continues to this day. And within that system, the Wandjina are not gone. They are still present, still watching. And that idea changes how you look at the paintings, because they are not depictions of something that once existed. They are acknowledgments of something that still does. Now, from an archaeological standpoint, the paintings are estimated to be at least 4,000 years old, possibly much older in origin. And they are not isolated. Hundreds of Wandjina figures exist across the region, consistent in style, consistent in form. The same large heads, the same eyes, the same absence of a mouth, repeated again and again, which suggests something important. This was not random creativity. This was a shared vision, a collective understanding. Now, skeptics offer a grounded explanation. They suggest that the Wandjina represent cloud and rain spirits, the large heads symbolizing storm clouds, the radiating lines representing lightning or rain, the absence of a mouth reflecting the silence of these forces. And this interpretation fits. It aligns with the environment, with the importance of rainfall in the region, with the symbolic language of nature. But even within that explanation, there are details that remain unusual, because symbolism typically evolves, it shifts, it varies across regions. Yet the Wandjina remain remarkably consistent, the same form, the same structure, the same presence across thousands of years. And consistency like that raises a quiet question. What was the original reference? What did the first artists see or believe they saw that set this image in place? Because once a form becomes established, it is preserved, but something had to start it, and that origin point is lost. There are no written records, no first account, no initial explanation, only the continuation, passed down across generations. And that continuity is powerful, because it suggests that whatever the Wandjina represent, it mattered enough to never be forgotten, even in one of the most isolated regions on Earth, even without contact with the outside world, even without written language. The image remained, and perhaps that is the most important detail. Not what the Wandjina are, but what they represent. A connection between sky and land, between past and present, between something seen and something remembered. And whether that connection is purely symbolic or rooted in something more literal is a question that remains open, because the Wandjina do not explain themselves. They do not offer answers. They simply remain, silent, watching, unchanged. And maybe that is why they feel so unsettling, because they do not belong entirely to the past. They exist in a space that feels ongoing, as if the story they represent is not finished. And as you stand in front of those figures, looking into those dark, unblinking eyes, there is a moment, a brief, quiet moment, where it doesn't feel like you are observing them, but that they are observing you. The stone that record is cosmic disaster. There are some places in the world where history doesn't feel like a story. It feels like a warning, not written in words, not spoken through generations, but carved into stone so massive, so deliberate, that it was never meant to be ignored. In southeastern Turkey, on a quiet hill overlooking the landscape, lies one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made. Göbekli Tepe, to around 9600 BC. That's nearly 12,000 years ago. Long before cities, long before writing, long before what we traditionally call civilization. And yet, what stands here should not exist. Massive stone pillars, weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in precise circular formations, carved with animals, symbols, figures, all created by people we once believed were simple hunter-gatherers. But Göbekli Tepe changes that assumption completely, because nothing about this site is simple, and among all its pillars, one stands apart. Pillar 43, often referred to as the vulture stone. At first glance, it appears like many other ancient carvings, animals etched into stone, stylized, symbolic, a vulture with outstretched wings, a scorpion below it, other creatures arranged around the surface. But the longer you look, the more it begins to feel like something else. Not decoration, but composition, because the animals are not randomly placed. They are positioned, carefully, deliberately, as if each one belongs exactly where it is, like elements in a system, or symbols in a language. Now pause, because this is where interpretation begins to shift. For decades, archaeologists viewed these carvings as ritualistic, mythological, expressions of belief, and that explanation still holds weight. But in 2017, a team of researchers from the University of Edinburgh proposed something different, something far more specific. They suggested that the vulture stone is not just symbolic, but astronomical. According to their analysis, the animals carved into the pillar may correspond to constellations, not exactly as we see them today, but as they would have appeared in the sky thousands of years ago. And when they mapped those positions against the carvings, a pattern emerged, one that pointed to a very specific moment in time, around 10,950 BC, a date that may not seem important at first, but in geological history, it marks something dramatic: the onset of the Younger Dryas, a sudden and severe climate event. Temperatures dropped, ecosystems collapsed, large animals went extinct, and some researchers believe it may have been triggered by a cosmic impact, a comet, or fragments of one, striking the Earth. Now, according to this interpretation, the vulture stone is not just recording the sky, it is recording that event. The vulture, holding what appears to be a sphere, represents the comet. The surrounding animals represent constellations visible at the time, and the headless human figure below represents death, mass death, a catastrophe so significant that it needed to be remembered, not just for one generation, but for all that followed. Now, to be clear, this theory is debated. Not all archaeologists agree. Not all researchers accept the interpretation, because correlation is not proof, and ancient symbols can have multiple meanings. But even skeptics acknowledge something important: the carvings are not random, they are structured, and that structure suggests intention. Which brings us to a deeper question. What were the builders of Göbekli Tepe trying to preserve? Because constructing something like this requires effort, coordination, planning. You do not move 20-ton stones, carve them with precision, arrange them in circles without purpose. And that purpose feels larger than daily life. This is not a shelter, not a home, not a tool. It is something else, something symbolic, or informational, or both. And then there is one detail that often goes unnoticed. Göbekli Tepe was not destroyed. It was buried, intentionally. The builders themselves filled it in, covered it, sealed it beneath the earth. And that action is deeply unusual, because most ancient sites are abandoned, left to decay. But this one was preserved, almost as if it was meant to be found later. Now think about that. A structure built 12,000 years ago, then deliberately buried to survive, to remain intact, to wait. And when it was rediscovered in the 1990s, it was still there. The carvings, the pillars, the arrangement, all preserved. The arrangement, all preserved, like a message frozen in time. And whether that message is astronomical, mythological, or something we have not yet fully understood, it remains unchanged. Because the stone does not explain itself. It does not tell us what it means. It only presents the symbols and leaves us to interpret them. But interpretation has limits, because without context, meaning becomes uncertain, and uncertainty creates space. Space for questions, space for theories, space for possibilities that sit just beyond what we can confirm. And perhaps that is why Göbekli Tepe feels so important, not because it proves a specific theory, but because it forces us to reconsider something fundamental: the timeline. Because if people 12,000 years ago were capable of building this, of organizing this, of carving symbols with this level of intention, then our understanding of early human capability may be incomplete. Not wrong, but incomplete. And within that gap, between what we know and what we are still trying to understand, the vulture stone continues to sit, silent, its symbols unchanged, its meaning debated, a record of something. Whether that something is a story, a belief, or a memory of an event so vast, it reached from the sky and changed everything below it. And maybe the most unsettling part is this: if it is a record, then it is not just telling us what happened. It is reminding us that it can happen again. The tribe that knew a star they couldn't see. There are some mysteries that begin not with objects, but with knowledge. Knowledge that appears in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the hands of people who, according to everything we think we know, should not have had it. Because objects can be misinterpreted, symbols can be misunderstood, but knowledge, especially precise knowledge, is harder to explain away. In the cliffs of Mali, West Africa, lives a group of people whose traditions stretch back further than recorded history. The Dogon people. For generations, they have preserved a complex system of beliefs, stories passed down through ritual, through ceremony, through oral traditions so precise that details remain intact across centuries. At the center of that tradition is a story about beings known as the Nomo. According to the Dogon, the Nomo were not from Earth. They came from the sky. They arrived in a vessel, a spinning object, descending with great force, accompanied by wind, by sound, by something described as a violent disturbance of the air. And when they arrived, they did not conquer, they did not destroy, they taught, they brought knowledge, order, structure. They shaped the foundations of Dogon cosmology, and then they remained part of it, not as distant gods, but as participants in a system that continues to this day. Now, on its own, this story is not unique. Many cultures speak of sky beings, visitors, teachers. But what makes the Dogon story different is not the narrative, it's the detail. Because within their tradition, the Dogon describe a star system, not just any star, but Sirius, visible to the naked eye, known to many ancient cultures. But the Dogon didn't stop there. They described a second star, Sirius B, a star that cannot be seen without advanced telescopes, a star that is incredibly small, incredibly dense, a star that orbits Sirius A in a cycle of approximately 50 years. Now pause, because this is where the story becomes difficult to ignore. Western astronomy first confirmed the existence of Sirius B in 1862. It was not directly observed until much later, not photographed until the 20th century. And yet, according to anthropological records, the Dogon had knowledge of this star, its existence, its properties, its orbit, encoded in their traditions, and tied to a ceremonial cycle. Every 50 years, the Dogon perform a ritual known as the Sigei, a ceremony that aligns with the orbital period of Sirius B. Now, consider what that implies. A culture with no telescopes, no written astronomy, no recorded contact with advanced scientific systems, tracking the movement of a star they should not have been able to see. This is the point where explanations begin to divide. Some researchers, like Marcel Grouet, who studied the Dogon in the 1930s, took the claims seriously. They documented the knowledge, recorded the traditions, and presented them as evidence of something extraordinary. But others were more skeptical. They suggested contamination, that the Dogon may have acquired this knowledge through contact with Europeans, missionaries, explorers, scientists, that the information was introduced, then absorbed into local tradition over time. And on the surface, that explanation seems reasonable, because cultural exchange does happen. Information spreads, ideas travel. But here's where the discomfort remains: the level of detail. Because it's one thing to hear about a star, it's another to describe its density, its invisibility, its orbital behavior, and integrate all of that into a structured belief system, into rituals, into ceremonies, into a cosmology that predates modern science, and to maintain that system across generations, without distortion, that is far more difficult to explain. There is another detail: the Nomo themselves, described not as human, not as animals, but as amphibious beings, part fish, part humanoid, associated with water, with life, with creation, and often depicted in forms that do not align with typical human anatomy. Now again, symbolism can account for this. Water is life, fish are ancient symbols. Creation myths often involve hybrid beings. But when combined with the astronomical knowledge, the story begins to take on a different weight, not proof, but tension. because it sits at the intersection of two things, myth and data. And when myth contains data, especially data that aligns with modern discovery, it becomes harder to dismiss entirely, but also harder to accept at face value. So we are left in a space of uncertainty, where neither explanation fully resolves the question. And perhaps that is where the Dogon mystery becomes most powerful, not in what it proves, but in what it challenges, because it forces us to consider a possibility that knowledge does not always follow the path we expect, that information can exist outside of written systems, outside of formal science, preserved in ways we do not fully understand, through memory, through ritual, through tradition. And if that is true, then the absence of evidence does not always mean the absence of knowledge, but there is one final detail, one that lingers. Because regardless of how the Dogon acquired this information, it is there, documented, recorded, and still part of their living tradition. The stars they speak of still exist, still move, still follow the patterns they describe. And that connection between ancient belief and observable reality is difficult to ignore, because it suggests that somewhere, at some point, a bridge was formed between what was seen and what was understood. And whether that bridge was built through observation, through contact, or through a process we have yet to fully comprehend, remains unanswered. But the question itself does not go away, because when a culture knows something it should not know, the mystery is not just in the knowledge, it is in the origin. And origins are where history begins to shift, the figures that look back from 10,000 years ago. There are some discoveries that don't feel ancient, not because they are new, not because they are preserved, but because when you look at them, they feel familiar, not in the way history should feel familiar, but in a way that's harder to explain, as if something from the distant past is reflecting an image we only recognize in the present. 6. In the forests of central India, in the state of Chhattisgarh, there are caves, quiet, isolated, untouched for thousands of years, places where time doesn't feel like it has passed, but simply paused. And inside those caves are paintings. Not unusual on their own, India is home to thousands of prehistoric rock art sites, scenes of hunting, animals, daily life. But these are different. They don't show animals. They don't show ordinary human activity. They show figures, standing upright, humanoid in shape. But something about them is wrong. Their bodies are thin, simplified, but their heads are large, perfectly round, not elongated, not stylized in a natural way, but circular, almost like helmets. And their eyes are oversized, dark, dominant, taking up far more space than they should. In some paintings, the figures appear to wear something, full body coverings, structured forms, not loose clothing, not fabric, but something that looks contained, defined. And in their hands, they hold objects, long, straight, unfamiliar, not tools we recognize, not weapons we can easily name, objects that don't seem to belong to any known prehistoric toolkit. And then there is the most striking detail of all. Above them, in the space where the sky would be, there are shapes, circular, disc-like, floating. Now pause, because this is where interpretation becomes unavoidable. Because the moment you look at these images, your mind does something automatically. It compares, it searches for something familiar, and what it finds is not from ancient history. It's from modern imagination. Spacesuits, helmets, flying objects, and suddenly the paintings begin to feel uncomfortably contemporary. But these images are not modern. They have been dated to over 10,000 years ago. Let that settle in. 10,000 years. Long before recorded civilization. Long before written language. Long before any known technological development that could resemble what we are seeing. And yet, here they are, painted onto stone, preserved across millennia. Now, archaeologists approach this carefully because interpretation is dangerous. it's easy to project modern ideas onto ancient art, to see what we expect to see, so the official explanation remains grounded. These figures are symbolic, representations of imagination, of dreams, of mythological beings. The round heads could be masks, the objects could be ritual items, the floating shapes could be symbolic elements, and all of that is possible. But then something happened. That made the story more complicated. When these caves were studied, local villagers were asked about them, and they didn't respond with confusion. They didn't say the figures were unknown. They had a story, a name. They called them the Rohela people. According to local tradition, these were small beings. They came from the sky. They arrived in round flying objects, and sometimes they took people with them. People who never returned. Now again, this does not prove anything extraordinary. Stories evolve, oral traditions adapt. But when a visual depiction and a spoken tradition align in their core idea, it becomes harder to dismiss entirely, because now we are not just looking at art, we are looking at a narrative, one that has survived in two forms, image and memory, and both are telling a similar story. There is another detail. These caves are not isolated. Similar paintings have been found roughly 250 kilometers away in another region, different location, different cave system, but the same kind of figures, large heads, unusual bodies, repetition. Now think about that. Separate locations, no direct connection. And yet, the same imagery appears, which suggests something important. This was not a one-time creation. This was a pattern, a repeated idea, and repetition implies meaning, because people do not preserve images across distances, across generations, unless those images matter. Now, to be clear, there is no scientific evidence that these paintings depict extraterrestrial beings, no physical remains, no technological artifacts, nothing that confirms that interpretation. But that doesn't resolve the discomfort, because the question isn't just, what are these? It's, why do they look like this? Why large, round heads? Why structured bodies? Why objects that don't match known tools? Why shapes in the sky? Because even if these are symbolic, symbols come from somewhere. They are inspired, influenced, rooted in something seen or imagined. And imagination, even in its most abstract form, is built from experience. So what experiences led to these images? What ideas shaped these forms? What stories were important enough to be painted onto stone and preserved for over 10,000 years? And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is not what these paintings show, but how they feel. Because when you look at them, you don't feel like you're looking at something completely alien. You feel like you're looking at something you almost recognize. And that familiarity creates tension, because it suggests one of two things. Either we are projecting our modern ideas onto the past, or there is a deeper pattern, a recurring image that appears across time in ways we don't yet fully understand. And that possibility doesn't give answers, but it does something else. It lingers, because once you've seen those figures standing there with their round heads, their silent expressions, their unknown objects, you can't fully unsee them. And maybe that's the point, because history doesn't always reveal itself clearly. Sometimes it leaves behind fragments, images, symbols, moments frozen in time, and waits for someone to look at them and ask the question that hasn't been answered yet. What exactly were they trying to show us? 8 discoveries, 8 moments in history where something doesn't quite fit, not because the evidence is missing, but because the evidence is missing, but because the explanations don't fully close the gap. An underground city built for thousands with no clear beginning, figures that look almost human but not quite, carvings that resemble machines centuries before machines existed, a stone object shaped with a precision that feels strangely familiar, a slab of rock that may be mapping something we don't fully understand. Sky beings painted in one of the most isolated places on Earth, still remembered as real. A tribe with knowledge of a star they should not have been able to see. And images from 10,000 years ago that look like they belong to the future. Individually, each one can be explained, or at least partially explained. But together, they create something else. A pattern, not a clear one, not a proven one, but enough to raise a question that quietly sits beneath all of them. What if history is not as simple as we've been told? Not wrong, but incomplete. Because maybe the past was not a straight line. Maybe knowledge didn't move forward in a steady progression. Maybe it rose, reached a peak, and then something happened. Something that scattered fragments across time, across continents, across cultures that would later forget where those fragments came from, and what we're left with today are pieces. Pieces we try to fit together using a framework that might not be big enough. And that's the part that stays with you, not the answers, but the possibility that we're still asking the wrong questions. A call to action engagement hook. So now I want to hear from you. Which one of these discoveries feels the most difficult to explain? Do you think all of this can be explained by coincidence, symbolism, and misinterpretation? Or do you think there's something deeper here? Something we haven't fully understood yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everything, and if you enjoy exploring mysteries like this, not just the stories, but the questions behind them, make sure you subscribe, because the deeper you go into history, the stranger it becomes. And trust me, we're just getting started.